New York City, 1885. Ulysses S. Grant's funeral procession stretched for miles. Thousands lined the streets. Then he saw a lone black veteran standing at attention with tears streaming down his face. What Grant did next, stepping out of his carriage in front of the entire nation, changed how America remembered him forever. It was July 23rd. The summer heat was oppressive, brutal, the kind that made the air shimmer above the cobblestones and turned Fifth Avenue into a furnace. 20 years after the Civil War ended, America was still trying to figure out what it had become. The North and South were technically reunited, but the wounds hadn't healed. They'd just scarred over, hiding the infection underneath. Reconstruction had failed. Jim Crow was rising. The promises made to 4 million freed slaves were being systematically broken, state by state, law by law. Ulysses S. Grant was dying. Throat cancer, the most painful kind. It had started as a persistent soreness, then became an agony that made every swallow feel like swallowing glass, every breath a labor. The doctors had given him weeks at most, maybe only days. They'd been saying that for months now, and somehow Grant kept living, kept fighting. The same stubborn determination that had won Vicksburg and beaten Lee now turned toward squeezing every last hour from his ravaged body. At 63 years old, the man who'd saved the Union, who'd accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox, who'd served 2 controversial terms as president, was being consumed from the inside out. The tumor in his throat was visible now when he opened his mouth. He could barely speak above a whisper, could barely swallow even water. The pain was constant, relentless, managed only barely by morphine that left him foggy and distant. But today, he'd insisted on attending. The Grand Army of the Republic was holding a memorial parade for the fallen soldiers of the Civil War. 20 years since the war ended. 20 years of trying to remember. Grant had been too sick to leave his cottage in the Adirondacks for months, but when the invitation came, something in him stirred. "I need to be there," he'd written to his wife Julia in his shaky handwriting. "For the men." The ride from the train station to the parade route was excruciating. Grant sat in an open carriage, wrapped in blankets despite the July heat, his once powerful frame now skeletal. His son Frederick sat beside him, holding his father's hand, terrified that every breath might be the last. Crowds lined Fifth Avenue, thousands of people. They'd come to see the old general one final time, to say goodbye to the man who'd saved them. Some cheered, others just stood in respectful silence. Many wept openly. This wasn't a celebration, this was a living funeral. Everyone knew Grant was dying. Everyone knew this might be his last public appearance. The newspapers had been counting down his days for months, publishing minute-by-minute updates on his condition like he was a condemned man awaiting execution. The procession moved slowly. Carriages filled with aging veterans, soldiers in Union blue now gray-haired and limping, brass bands playing dirges. The parade was supposed to honor the dead. But really, everyone was there for Grant, to witness, to remember, to grieve. Then Grant saw him, on the corner of 14th Street and 5th Avenue, standing apart from the crowd, not pushed to the margins but choosing to stand alone. A black man, maybe 50 years old, though hardship had a way of aging men beyond their years. He wore a tattered Union uniform that had clearly been carefully mended and pressed for this occasion. The blue wool was faded nearly gray, patched at the elbows and knees, the brass buttons dulled with age. It was too small for him now. His shoulders had broadened with years of manual labor, and the jacket strained across his back. But he'd buttoned it all the way up despite the suffocating heat, standing at rigid military attention like he was back on the parade ground at readiness inspection. His face was weathered, lined with decades of sun and work and disappointment. But what struck Grant, what made him stare, were the tears streaming down the man's dark cheeks, catching the bright July sunlight as they fell. The man wasn't wiping them away, wasn't hiding them, just standing there at attention, weeping openly as the procession passed. His eyes were fixed on Grant's carriage with an intensity that bordered on desperate. like he needed Grant to see him, like it mattered more than anything that this one moment, this one recognition happened before it was too late. Grant felt something crack open in his chest. He knew that look. He'd seen it at Appomattox, at Shiloh, at Cold Harbor. The look of men who'd given everything and received nothing, who'd survived when they should have died, who carried the weight of all the friends who didn't make it home. What Grant did next shocked everyone on that street. "Stop!" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Grant's voice was destroyed by the cancer, but Frederick heard it. "Father?" "Stop the carriage." Grant's hand gripped his son's arm with surprising strength. "Now!" Frederick signaled to the driver. The carriage lurched to a halt. The entire procession behind them had to stop. Confusion rippled through the crowd. What was happening? Was Grant collapsing? Was this the end? Grant was already trying to stand. His legs barely worked. The cancer and months of bed rest had wasted his muscles. Frederick grabbed his father's arm. "Father, you can't. Help me down." It wasn't a request. Frederick and another aide had to physically lift Grant from the carriage and support him as his feet touched the cobblestones. The crowd gasped. Some people screamed. Grant was standing. Barely, but standing, in front of thousands of witnesses. And he was walking toward the black veteran. Each step was agony. Grant's face twisted with pain, but he kept moving. Frederick stayed close, ready to catch his father when he fell. The black veteran's eyes went wide. He broke from attention, took a step back. This couldn't be real. The general was coming toward him. Grant reached him. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The white general who'd won the war. The black soldier who'd helped him win it. Then Grant did something that made the entire street go silent. He opened his arms. The veteran hesitated, looked around at the thousands of eyes watching. White eyes, black eyes, northern eyes, southern eyes still bitter with defeat. This was 1885, 20 years after the war ended, but in so many ways nothing had changed. Reconstruction had been abandoned. The Compromise of 1877 had pulled federal troops out of the South, leaving black citizens to the mercy of white supremacist governments. Lynchings were becoming commonplace. The Ku Klux Klan operated with impunity. A black man embracing a white general in public. In New York City, supposedly the liberal North, it was unthinkable, dangerous, the kind of thing that could get a man killed. Grant's arms stayed open, trembling with the effort, his body swaying slightly. "Please," he whispered, the word barely audible pushed out through the cancer that was choking him. The veteran stepped forward, slowly, like a man walking through water, and Grant embraced him, pulled him close, held him with the last reserves of his failing strength. This dying old man using strength he didn't have to hold a forgotten soldier, to tell him without words that he mattered, that he was seen, that his service meant something. The veteran broke down completely. His shoulders shook with sobs he'd probably been holding back for 20 years, sobs for his brother who died at Fort Wagner, for all his friends who never came home, for the country that sent them to war and then forgot they'd ever existed. Grant held him tighter, one hand on the back of the man's head, the other around his shoulders, like a father comforting a son who'd been lost and was finally found. Around them, the crowd didn't know how to react. Some applauded, others wept. Many just stared in shocked silence. Frederick heard his father whispering something. He stepped closer. Grant was speaking directly into the veteran's ear. Private words. Sacred words. But what Grant said next would be remembered for generations. After a long moment, Grant gently pulled back. He looked the veteran in the eyes. Then, with Frederick's help, he carefully, painfully lowered himself to one knee on the cobblestones. The crowd gasped again. The general was kneeling, in the street, in front of a black man. Grant reached up and took the veteran's scarred hands in his own. "Tell me your name," he said, his destroyed voice forcing each word out. Joshua Freeman, sir." 54th Massachusetts Infantry. The veteran's voice trembled. The 54th, Grant nodded slowly. Fort Wagner. Yes, sir. You were at Fort Wagner. It wasn't a question. The 54th Massachusetts had been one of the first African-American regiments in the Union Army. They'd led the suicidal assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. 600 men attacked a heavily fortified position. Over half were killed or wounded. They'd fought with unprecedented courage, and they'd been mostly forgotten. I was, sir. Lost my brother there, lost most of my company. Grant's eyes filled with tears. I never thanked you, any of you. We won that war because of men like you, like your brother. But when it was over, we let the nation forget. We let them push you aside, pretend you hadn't bled for this country. His voice broke. I'm sorry. God forgive me, I'm sorry. Joshua was crying so hard he could barely stand. Sir, you don't have to. I do. Grant's grip tightened on Joshua's hands. You fought for a country that wouldn't even let you vote in most states. You wore this uniform proudly, and 20 years later you're standing alone on a street corner while the nation celebrates a war you helped us win. That's not right. That's not what you fought for. Frederick tried to help his father stand. Grant waved him off. He wasn't finished. From his coat pocket he pulled out a small leather case. Inside was a medal, one of his own military decorations. He'd carried it with him, Frederick realized. His father had known he would need it. Grant pressed the medal into Joshua's hands. This belongs to you, to all of you, the 54th, the 55th. Every black man who put on this uniform when it meant certain death if you were captured. Every man who fought for freedom when you had none. He took a shaking breath. I won't live to see it, but someday this nation will remember, will honor you the way you deserved from the start. Until then, you carry this. And you remember that Ulysses Grant said you were the bravest men he ever commanded. Joshua couldn't speak. He just held the medal and wept. Grant finally let Frederick help him to his feet. It took 3 men to support him now. He'd used everything he had. But before they could help him back to the carriage, Grant turned to the crowd, to the thousands watching. He couldn't project his voice anymore. But people were so silent you could have heard a pin drop. This man, Grant said, pointing to Joshua, is an American hero. He fought for all of you. Remember him, honor him, or we fought that war for nothing. The crowd erupted, not in polite applause, in something raw. Some people cheered, many wept. Arguments broke out, people shouting at each other about race, about the war, about what it all meant. But something had broken open, something had shifted. They had to carry Grant back to the carriage. He'd collapsed, used everything. Frederick was terrified they'd lost him right there on Fifth Avenue. But as they laid him down, Grant's eyes were open. He was smiling. The first real smile Frederick had seen in months. Grant died 16 days later, August 8, 1885, at his cottage in Mount McGregor, New York. His last words, written because he could no longer speak, were about the war, about the cost, about the men. Joshua Freeman attended Grant's funeral. He wore the medal Grant had given him pinned to his old uniform. And he wasn't alone. 23 other black veterans stood with him, in the funeral procession, not on the sidelines, in it. The funeral organizers tried to move them to the back. Joshua refused. General Grant put us here, he said. This is where we're staying. They let them stay. Joshua lived until 1917, 52 more years. He never took off that medal. He told the story of that day on Fifth Avenue to anyone who would listen. To his children, his grandchildren, to young black men who were told they didn't matter. The general got on his knees, Joshua would say. Dying man got on his knees in front of me and said I was a hero. You remember that. You're all heroes. In 1990, over a century later, the United States Mint issued a commemorative coin honoring the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. The design showed black soldiers charging Fort Wagner. At the unveiling ceremony, Joshua Freeman's great-great-granddaughter spoke. She was a colonel in the United States Army. She wore her great-great-grandfather's medal, the one Grant had given him, pinned to her dress uniform. "My ancestor stood on a corner in 1885, she said, watching a parade that didn't include him, watching a nation celebrate a war where men like him were erased from the story." Then Ulysses Grant stopped, got out of his carriage, knelt in front of my grandfather, and changed everything. She held up the medal. "This isn't just about one general and one soldier. This is about being seen, being remembered, being honored." My grandfather waited 72 years for the nation to catch up to what Grant told them that day. That black soldiers mattered, that our service mattered, that we helped save this country. She paused, looked at the coin displaying the charging soldiers of the 54th. "It took too long, but we got here, because one dying man used his last strength to make us impossible to ignore." There's a lesson in that July afternoon that echoes across time. Power is nothing if you don't use it to honor the powerless. Grant had days to live. He could have stayed in his carriage, could have preserved his strength, could have let the moment pass. But he didn't. He saw a man who deserved recognition, who'd earned honor, who'd been forgotten by the very nation he'd helped save. And Grant used the last of his strength to make sure the world saw him too. In the end, we're not remembered for our titles or our victories. We're remembered for the moments we stepped out of our carriages, for the people we honored when everyone else looked away, for the times we got on our knees, even when it cost us everything. Subscribe for more untold human stories from America's past.